It was well past midnight, and Diana Miller was wide awake, plagued by a sense of unease. She wasn't sure of the exact time, but she knew it was far too late for anyone to be calling. When the phone rang for the 5th time, she barely managed to get comfortable under the covers before the insistent ringing started up again. "Damn it!" she muttered, throwing the pillow over her head. "Martin! Answer your damn phone," she shouted, but then the realization hit her. Martin wasn't in bed with her. Panic surged through her as she glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 3:37 a.m. She grabbed her phone and answered groggily. "Hello? Is this Diana Miller?" a strained voice asked. Yes it is. Who is this?" "This is the emergency room at Northtown Medical Center. Your husband, Martin Miller, was brought in about an hour ago. We have his contact information from an incident a year ago. He was in a car accident. Can you come over right away?" Diana's heart sank. "Oh my God, is he okay?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss his condition over the phone, ma'am. Please come to the hospital as soon as you can." "Of course, I'll be there immediately." Diana raced upstairs to her daughter Dallas's room. Dallas, who had chosen to stay home from college to save money, was sound asleep. Diana shook her gently. "Dee, wake up." Dallas mumbled incoherently and turned away. Diana shook her again, this time more firmly. "Dallas, wake up. Your father's been in an accident. We need to go to the hospital." Dallas sat up groggily, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. She quickly pulled on her nightgown, not even noticing her own nakedness as she hurriedly dressed. Diana didn't pay much attention, consumed by her own worries and the urgency of the situation. Within minutes, mother and daughter were speeding toward the hospital. Dallas bombarded her mother with questions, but Diana had no answers. The drive felt interminable, though it was only about 10 minutes due to the lack of traffic. When they arrived, they were directed to Martin's room in the emergency department. The sight that greeted them was harrowing. Martin was lying in a hospital bed, covered in bandages and completely unconscious. The sterile, clinical environment was a stark contrast to the chaos in Diana's mind. They were handed a stack of paperwork, a cruel reminder that even in the midst of a crisis, bureaucracy waits for no one. Dallas took a seat beside her father, her face pale and distraught. They had barely settled in when 2 police officers entered the room. "Good evening," the woman officer began. "I'm Officer Gail Stanton, and this is my partner, Robert Hansen. We were the first responders to the scene. We need to ask you a few questions." Diana looked up, her face etched with worry. "Certainly. Is there any news on his condition?" Officer Stanton shook her head. "Not yet. We need to ask you about the circumstances surrounding the accident. Do you know why your husband was out at this hour?" Diana shook her head. "He was at home with us. We went to bed together around 10 p.m. I had no idea he was gone until the hospital called." Dallas, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Yes, we watched a movie together. It ended around 10, and then we all went to bed. I saw Dad go into the bedroom with Mom. It was some action movie with Keanu Reeves. Dad picked it." Officer Hansen took notes as he listened. "Did you have any special problems, financial or marital, anything that might explain why he would leave without telling you?" Diana's voice wavered. "No, we didn't have any unusual problems. Nothing that most married couples don't face. I just don't understand why he left without saying anything." The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Stanton spoke again. "According to witnesses, it was a single-car accident. Your husband's car was reported to be driving normally when, without warning, it suddenly accelerated and crashed into a large oak tree at the intersection of Highways 121 and 288. There were no skid marks, and no one remembers seeing brake lights." Diana felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The details of the accident were chilling, and the lack of information about what had led to the crash only heightened her fear. She clutched Dallas's hand, both of them waiting in tense silence for more information. The night was dragging on, and with each passing moment, the uncertainty about Martin's condition weighed heavier on their hearts. Dallas stared at the officers, her face a mask of confusion and hurt as she tried to process their implications. "Are you suggesting that my husband did this on purpose? Are you saying he tried to commit suicide?" Her voice trembled with disbelief. The lead officer, Officer Stanton, nodded solemnly. "We need to inspect the vehicle for any potential mechanical issues, and of course, we'll need to speak with your husband once he's awake. Right now, considering all possibilities is part of our procedure." Dallas's eyes welled up, her heart pounding. "Are you sure there weren't any issues we should discuss, officers? I love my husband dearly. We have a wonderful marriage. There are no problems that I can think of. I'm sure he just lost control or dozed off. It was very late. I'm certain there's a reasonable explanation." Her voice cracked as she tried to hold back her tears, but the dam broke, and she was unable to finish her sentence. Officer Stanton, sensing her distress, left a card on the table. "If you remember anything else, please don't hesitate to call. We'll be in touch." With that, he and his partner left the hospital. Dallas closed the door to Martin's room, her hands shaking. "Did you tell them?" she asked her mother, who had been sitting quietly by the side. "No, Dallas, I didn't," her mother replied softly, her own eyes red from crying. "It's none of their business and doesn't have anything to do with what happened. Your father didn't mind, and maybe he'll say something when they talk to him. We'll see." The days that followed were a blur of waiting and hoping. Martin remained unconscious, and both Diana and Dallas spent every possible moment at the hospital, ensuring that he was never alone. Diana, who knew Martin's boss, had informed him of the situation, carefully avoiding any mention of a possible suicide attempt. The accident had occurred late Saturday night, and by Wednesday morning, there were signs that Martin might be waking up. By noon, his eyes fluttered open, though he could only take in his surroundings weakly. Diana, always by his side, noticed the change immediately and went to his bedside to offer reassurance. Before she could fully settle, a nurse hurried into the room, alerted by the monitors that Martin was waking up. Diana took a step back to allow the medical team to do their work, and seized the moment to step outside and call Dallas. The call went unanswered, so Diana left a voicemail updating her on Martin's condition. As the doctors and nurses attended to Martin, they removed most of the medical equipment. His left arm was broken, but being right-handed, this wouldn't be too debilitating. His throat was sore from the breathing tube, so they provided him with a whiteboard for communication. The nurse read Martin's message and asked if he was certain about his request. Martin nodded, and the nurse swiftly exited the room. Moments later, Mrs. Miller was informed that Martin had specifically requested that she and Diana be kept out of his room. "What do you mean, he doesn't want us in the room?" Diana demanded, her voice edged with frustration. "He's my husband, I have every right to be with him." "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Miller, but the patient's wishes come first," the nurse said firmly. "I'll speak with him and see if we can sort this out. For now, please wait outside." Diana tried to push past the nurse but was stopped. Martin, please talk to me. What's happening? Martin." Her pleas echoed down the hallway. "Mrs. Miller, please calm down. You're disturbing the other patients," the nurse said sternly. "You can wait outside, but if you continue to make a scene, we'll have to ask you to leave the hospital." Diana, with no other choice, reluctantly agreed and stepped away. Dallas arrived 45 minutes later, finding her mother in a chair outside Martin's room, looking distressed. "Mom, what's going on?" Dallas asked, her concern evident. "Why did Dad forbid us from seeing him? I understand why he might ban you, but why me? And why did it take you so long to get here?" "I had just woken up when Bradley came by to check on me," Dallas explained, her voice defensive. "I needed a break, it was really stressful. And besides, Dad was unconscious when I left." I needed to relax. Her mother's face showed a mixture of disappointment and exasperation. Well, you should have called too, Diana replied tersely. It's disrespectful to discuss this now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Dallas, who managed a small, rueful chuckle. Just then, there was a knock at the door, followed by the entrance of a tall, authoritative figure, signaling that more developments were on the way. Dr. Lasser was a striking brunette who exuded professionalism but didn't quite fit the typical image of a doctor. Her badge clearly identified her as part of the hospital staff, but her demeanor was more polished than clinical. She walked into the room with a measured grace, her professional attire accentuating her poised presence. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I'm Dr. Lasser, one of the hospital's mental health specialists. How are you feeling today?" Martin gave a wry smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose." 9 days had passed since the accident, and while he had regained his ability to speak, he had yet to receive any concrete information about his release. The hospital had finally decided it was time for a psychological evaluation, and Martin had no choice but to comply if he wanted to go home soon. Dr. Lasser pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, crossing her long legs with practiced ease. It took her a few moments to sift through the papers on her clipboard. "So, Mr. Miller, I see you were admitted here following a collision with a large tree. I also noticed that you've restricted your wife and daughter from visiting you. I'm starting to suspect there might be a connection between these events. Would you care to elaborate?" Martin's eyes darkened. "My wife cheated on me." Dr. Lasser nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately, infidelity is not uncommon these days, though it rarely leads to such drastic reactions. Is there more to the story?" Martin hesitated, his discomfort palpable. He had always been a private person, and discussing his personal life with a strikingly attractive woman made him even more uneasy. He wondered if there was an older, more stoic therapist he could speak with instead. Dr. Lasser's patience was evident. She had encountered many reluctant patients and was adept at waiting for them to open up in their own time. After several minutes of silence, Martin began to speak. "I've been dealing with depression," he confessed. "It wasn't officially diagnosed or anything, but I was depressed for a specific reason." "Specific reason?" Dr. Lasser prompted gently. "I couldn't get erections," Martin admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It started a little over a year ago, after another accident. I was in the back seat of a car, and we were rear-ended. It wasn't a severe crash, no airbags deployed, minimal damage. But I hit my head on the seat in front of me. The report said it was a mild concussion." Dr. Lasser nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. "The doctors couldn't explain it. None of the medications worked, and after a slew of tests, the best explanation was that something in my brain got damaged. So, the inability to achieve erections led to dissatisfaction in your marriage, which in turn led to your wife seeking fulfillment elsewhere. This eventually contributed to the incident that brought you here. Is that a fair summary?" "Yes," Martin said quietly. "My wife started cheating about 7 or 8 months after the accident. We tried other methods to deal with it. There are certain types of help available, if you know what I mean." Dr. Lasser raised an eyebrow slightly. "Yes, I understand. Did your wife discuss her dissatisfaction with you beforehand?" "No," Martin said. "I found out by coming home early from work one day. I walked in and found not just my wife with her lover, but also my daughter and her boyfriend." "Did they all engage together?" Dr. Lasser asked, her surprise evident. "No, thankfully," Martin replied. "Diana and her lover were in the bedroom, while Dallas and her boyfriend were in the living room. That's how I discovered everything, my wife's affair and the fact that my daughter knew and apparently condoned it." Dr. Lasser took notes, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Which explains why your daughter was also barred from visiting." "Yes," Martin confirmed. "And if I haven't mentioned it, Bill, Brad's father, was someone we knew from before, through our daughter's relationship with him." I later found out that it was Dallas who suggested Bill to her mother. That was another blow. Did you confront them? Dr. Lasser asked. Not really, Martin said. If Dallas hadn't been there, I might have confronted Diana directly. But after seeing my daughter in such a compromising position, I couldn't take it anymore. I left. And how did the conversation go after you confronted Diana? Not how I expected, Martin said. She was sorry I found out but made it clear that if I couldn't meet her needs, she would find someone else who could. She preferred a full-time partner, as she put it, rather than a part-time solution. She was ready to move on and find someone new. Dr. Lasser listened carefully, noting the emotional weight behind Martin's words. She could sense the deep hurt and frustration he was experiencing. This session was crucial in understanding the psychological impact of his recent trauma and the underlying issues that contributed to his current state. Bill was a single man with needs that aligned with her own, so it was no surprise he became her choice. What could I do? She lamented. It wasn't her fault I couldn't be intimate. If I couldn't give her what she needed, she had to do what she had to do. Hypothetically, if she had asked you in advance, would you have agreed? The question hung in the air. Bill had mulled it over extensively. Part of me wanted to say yes because I loved her and wanted her happiness. But, honestly, I don't think I could have accepted it. We made vows, promised in sickness and in health. I couldn't handle her being with someone else, especially not someone like Bill. It was obvious that she continued seeing him, and now that Bill knew, she was less discreet. I'm not sure how much more often it became, but it seemed like their encounters extended beyond the workdays. There were trips to the store on weekends and other times clearly spent with Bill. It must have been unbearable for her, Bill reflected. But it wasn't just difficult, it was soul-crushing, he continued. I felt trapped. She deserved a fulfilling sex life, but I couldn't provide that, and it was eating me alive. Tell me about the night of the accident, the doctor prompted. Bill recounted, we all watched the film on TV. I kept my emotional pain to myself. It was a mistake to hide it, but I didn't want to burden Diana or Dallas. They hugged and kissed goodnight, and as Dallas kissed me goodnight, I realized she had lost all respect for me. I could barely blame her, I didn't respect myself either. The routine was always the same. I went to bed, waited for Diana to fall asleep, then dressed and grabbed my wallet and keys. I went upstairs to check on Dallas. She was asleep, so I kissed her goodbye. I got in my car, knowing the airbags were there but thinking that if I hit hard enough, it wouldn't matter. I didn't have a clear plan, I just drove around. He had passed the big oak tree, noting its direct approach with no obstacles. I drove around once more and aimed straight for it. That's how it all happened. The room fell silent as the weight of Bill's story settled. Finally, Dr. Lasseter broke the silence. Mr. Miller, I appreciate your candor. It's a rarity. I'll let you rest and think about what you've shared. Is it okay if I come back tomorrow? Sure, I'm not going anywhere, Bill replied, his tone tinged with sarcasm. They shook hands, and Dr. Lasseter exited the room. Bill took out his phone, which Diana had brought him despite his request not to, and responded to several messages and emails. He updated his boss on the situation and then tried to rest. At home, Diana wrestled with her own emotions. She initially thought Marty's accident was a twisted gift from him, a bizarre sign of love. When she first heard about it, she didn't believe it was an accident, but now she was uncertain. She hoped the police wouldn't probe too deeply into her affair with Bill, understanding that extramarital affairs weren't illegal, so they might just consider it a suicide attempt and drop the matter. Still, Diana felt no guilt. She had no intention of living a life of celibacy because of some frame-up involving her husband's boss. This wasn't what she had signed up for, and she wasn't about to agree to it now. Once Marty returned home, she promised herself she would be more attentive to his feelings and maintain discretion about her relationship with Bill, but she was resolute that she wouldn't give up on him. The next morning, as promised, Dr. Lasseter returned. Bill noticed the subtle changes in the doctor's appearance, reflecting his own internal struggle. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Miller?" Dr. Lassiter asked. "Not much has changed," Bill replied, his voice heavy with the weight of his ongoing turmoil. The room was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound as Diana Miller sat in the hospital room, waiting for her husband, Martin, to be discharged. It had been a long 9 days since the accident, and although Martin was finally able to speak, his recovery was slow and fraught with uncertainty. Dr. Lasser, the hospital's mental health specialist, had been visiting him regularly, and today was the day they were to discuss his potential release. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Dr. Lasser said with a warm, reassuring smile. She was a striking brunette, dressed in professional attire that, while not doctorly, carried an air of competence. "How are you feeling today?" "As good as could be expected, I suppose," Martin replied. He had come a long way since the accident, but the road to full recovery seemed endlessly long. The whiteboard he had used to communicate was now a relic of the past, and his frustration with the hospital's vague answers about his release was palpable. "Well, partially," Dr. Lasser said, settling into a chair beside Martin's bed. "The state law requires a 72-hour observation period, and our clock started ticking with our conversation yesterday. So, you've got at least 2 more days here." Martin managed a wry smile. "Okay, Doc. At least the food here isn't that bad," he said, trying to make light of the situation. Dr. Lasser chuckled. "An oldie but a goodie," she agreed. "I'm glad to see you're joking. It's a sign of progress." Martin's smile faded slightly. "It's been months since I've felt like myself. I used to be the family joker, the guy who would go out of his way to make people laugh, even if it meant driving Dallas up the wall." Dr. Lasser leaned forward, her eyes compassionate. "Have you had any other troubling thoughts? Any dark alleys you're finding yourself wandering down?" Martin's expression grew serious. "You know, Doc, I don't think that's the case anymore. I spent a year feeling pretty depressed, and the last few months, it turned into anger. Anger at Diana, anger at Dallas, but mostly at myself. For not standing up for myself, for not showing Diana that what she was doing was unacceptable." "Do you intend to address these feelings now?" Dr. Lasser asked, genuinely interested. Martin nodded. "Undoubtedly. While I'm tempted to just get a divorce, I need to take some responsibility for letting her walk all over me. But if Diana agrees to stop seeing Bill, I'm willing to see a counselor and try to fix things. I want to repair our marriage." Dr. Lasser looked impressed. "I rarely see such a turnaround happen so quickly. It's admirable, Mr. Miller." "I've had a lot of time to think while I've been here," Martin said. "I appreciate the chance to finally talk about it. It's helped me focus my thoughts." "Excellent," Dr. Lasser said. "I'll finish up my assessments today. I'll check in with you one last time tomorrow, but barring any unforeseen issues, you should be able to leave on schedule." Martin's mood lifted slightly. "Looking forward to it, Doc." When the day finally came for Martin to leave, Diana and Dallas were there to pick him up. The drive home was filled with a tense silence, the weight of the past weeks hanging heavily over them. The house was quiet, save for the soft music playing in the background. Martin took a deep breath, determined to start afresh. He needed to address the underlying issues that had plagued their marriage. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for the first week after his return. The tension between them was palpable, but Martin hoped that things might improve if he acted as if they could change. However, trouble started brewing when Diana announced she needed to go shopping. "Marty," Diana said, a touch of irritation in her voice, "we need to get some things, including your healing creams. You can make a list for Dallas, and she can go." Dallas, hearing this, groaned. "Come on, Dad. I have plans with Bradley." Martin's voice was calm but firm. "No, Diana. There are things we need, and I need to be a part of this. Besides, Dallas can't be the one doing this alone." Diana looked perplexed. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? You can't come home and suddenly change everything." Martin's gaze was unwavering. "I know your shopping trips are an excuse to see Bill. I've noticed the way you look at me, the way you dress, the subtle changes in your makeup. It's clear you've been spending time with him." Diana's eyes widened in shock. Dallas, standing beside her, felt a flicker of respect for her father. "Marty, please," Diana pleaded. "We've discussed this already. I'll try to be more careful." Martin's voice grew steely. "If you can't keep your promises, then you need to stop seeing Bill. We need to go to counseling, or I'll call the divorce lawyer on Monday." Diana's face hardened. "Don't you dare threaten me. If I could have sex with you and only you, I would. But I can't, and it's not my fault. I wasn't even there when the accident happened." Martin's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "If our vows meant anything, we need to work on this or end it. No more excuses." The confrontation left a bitter taste, but it was clear that things had reached a breaking point. For Martin, the road to healing and possibly reconciliation was just beginning. Diana stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her with a crash that rattled the window panes. The sudden silence in the house was almost deafening. Inside, father and daughter exchanged worried glances. With a heavy sigh, Marty retreated to his bedroom, leaving Dallas to grapple with the gravity of the situation for the first time. Dallas had never been this concerned about her family's future. Her parents had their share of disagreements, but nothing ever seemed this severe. It was clear that this was between her mother and father, and there was nothing Dallas could do to change the situation. She composed herself and prepared to meet Bradley, hoping to find some solace. Diana, meanwhile, had started to entertain troubling thoughts. Part of her wished Marty would never recover because the thought of giving up Bill seemed impossible. Bill was forceful and dominant, he didn't hesitate to take what he wanted. In contrast, Marty was gentle and considerate. The disparity between them was glaring, and Diana was struggling with her feelings. By the time Dallas returned home, it was getting dark. She found her father resting in his bedroom. A faint glow was emanating from the bathroom, where the light was on and the door was slightly ajar. She realized that her father needed some light in the room, as none of the lamps provided the comfort he sought. "Dad?" Dallas called softly. He turned, and for a moment, she could see the sadness etched on his face. He had stopped using the endearing nicknames he once had for her after discovering she had helped her mother find a lover. Now, even as she stood there crying, Marty hesitated, unsure if it was a setup. Dallas approached the foot of the bed. "I'm sorry for what I did. I just wanted to help Mom. She was so distraught over everything you were going through. I didn't think about how it would affect you." Marty's eyes softened as he listened. Dallas continued, "Bradley's father has been going through the same pain ever since Mrs. Coyle passed away. Bradley says his dad always talks about how much he misses her, especially around this time. I thought they might be able to support each other. I never considered how it would impact you." Marty was taken aback by Dallas's candid confession. It could be a ruse, but he chose to believe her sincerity. If he was being fooled, so be it. He said, "I've been very depressed, just because I couldn't, well, you know." Their eyes met again, and for the first time in a long while, they shared a brief, understanding smile. "But it's over now, Deli," Marty said quietly. "I'm not going through this again." Dallas nodded, "I hope not. I need to know, are you going to divorce Mom?" "I haven't made any final decisions yet, honey," Marty replied, "but it's looking that way unless she stops seeing Bill. Keep this between us. She needs to change because she wants to, not because she has to." "Okay, Dad," Dallas said, standing up. "Oh, and I broke up with Bradley tonight." Marty tried to suppress his smile. He had never been fond of Bradley, but this was unexpected. "Why?" Dallas hesitated, then said, "Because my dad once told me he wasn't good enough for me. I finally realized he was right." I see now that he was right about a lot of things. A genuine smile spread across Marty's face as he recognized his daughter's growth. Dallas walked over to him and hugged him, a rare and cherished moment. They held each other for a few seconds before pulling away, smiling warmly. As Dallas left the room and went upstairs, Marty heard Diana's car door slam shut as she locked it. The fleeting joy he had felt dissipated instantly. He lay back down, closing his eyes, trying to escape the turmoil. Moments later, Diana entered the bedroom, having just taken a shower at Bill's place. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and Marty was left to confront the reality of his fractured life. Marty's patience was wearing thin as he watched Diana shuffle through the groceries she had just brought in. The bags were emptied onto the counter, and Marty noticed the conspicuous absence of any refrigerated or frozen items. Instead, there were a few canned goods and some non-perishables. His eyes fell on the receipt, which showed she had left the grocery store almost 2 hours ago. "Could you at least come back fresh and clean, rather than smelling like someone else's cologne?" Marty quipped, trying to mask the hurt in his voice. Diana, clearly irritated, responded with a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, Marty, I went grocery shopping and then I went to see Bill." The bluntness of her admission stung, but Marty had been expecting it. He didn't say anything more, his silence heavy with the weight of unspoken words. He unloaded the remaining bags and began putting things away, the mundane task a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within him. Heading to the bedroom, Marty felt a deep sense of resignation. It seemed futile to bring up the issue again. Diana had made her intentions clear. The next step was up to him, and he knew something had to change. He could no longer tolerate the situation as it was. Diana, sensing the tension, asked in a tone that suggested she was already prepared for his refusal, "Do you want to talk about this some more?" Marty shook his head. "No, Diana, you've made your position very clear." Diana's expression softened as she approached her husband. Despite the current turmoil, she still cared deeply for him. He was her best friend and the person she had once loved deeply. She hoped that, given time, Marty might come to understand her need for sexual satisfaction under the circumstances. Diana nodded, her mind already shifting gears. She headed to her closet to change into something more comfortable. She had considered rekindling some intimacy with Marty, but tonight wasn't the right time. By the time she was ready for bed, Marty was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. The divorce process was anything but smooth. Diana was furious when Marty served her with the papers, and she retaliated by hiring an aggressive lawyer. Her lawyer even attempted to declare Marty mentally incompetent, citing a supposed suicide attempt. Anticipating Diana's possible moves, Marty had entered counseling the same week the divorce paperwork was filed. The psychologist testified that Marty was no longer at risk, which swayed the judge in his favor. The legal battle dragged on, but just when it seemed like Diana was about to win, Dallas stepped in. She made it clear to her mother that her needs did not outweigh the vows and promises made in their marriage. Dallas emphasized that life wasn't always fair, and she had to stand by her father. She warned Diana that any further resistance could irreparably damage their mother-daughter relationship. Faced with the potential loss of both her husband and daughter, Diana had no choice but to relent. The divorce was finalized, and the house was sold. Marty agreed to a reasonable alimony arrangement, knowing the judge would likely order it anyway. Diana rented a 2-bedroom apartment close to her job, and for a while, she tried to move on. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Diana's bitterness only grew. Bill, her former lover, had ended their relationship, leaving her feeling discarded. It turned out Bill had been seeing other women, and Diana's attraction waned. The finality of her divorce and the failed relationship with Bill left her resentful. Dallas continued her studies at college, dividing her time between both parents. Over time, Diana began playing the victim, repeatedly blaming Marty for the divorce. When Dallas overheard her mother's complaints, she couldn't contain her frustration. "Did you ever think about Dad? He's not the only one at fault here, Dallas yelled during one of their arguments. One Friday night, Marty decided to escape the house and clear his mind. He walked into a dimly lit club around 10 p.m., hoping to find a temporary distraction. It was just another attempt to find a pleasant diversion from the mess his life had become. Martin decided to unwind after a long week and headed out for a few drinks. He settled onto a bar stool, ordered a rum and coke, and began surveying the crowd. His gaze landed on a woman at the far end of the bar, someone who seemed familiar but whose identity eluded him. She had a nearly empty glass of wine in front of her, her dark brown hair cascading down her shoulders, and her dress clung suggestively, barely covering her. Intrigued, Martin studied her more closely. As he sipped his drink, a faint smile crossed his lips. Mustering his courage, he walked over to her. As he approached, she looked up and their eyes met. "Dr. Lasser?" Martin ventured, unsure if he was mistaken. She examined him with a thoughtful look but didn't immediately register recognition. "I'm leaving the hospital behind for the evening. Here, I'm Vicky. But it seems you've got me at a disadvantage. It's been a while, and I'm sure you meet many more patients than I do with my clients. Excellent psychologists tend to be better with names than faces. Test me, Martin Miller, right?" Vicky paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the name. Martin watched her closely, and if asked later, he would have sworn he saw a spark of recognition light up in her eyes. "Ah, Mr. Miller," she said with a hint of a smile. "An unfaithful wife and a rather abrupt encounter with a tree, if I recall correctly." "You're right," Martin replied, impressed. "I'm amazed you remember. We only spoke a couple of times over a year ago, almost 2 years now." "Well, luck must be on our side," Vicky said, with a playful glint in her eyes. "Care to join me? I'm here to unwind, just like you." Martin sat down beside her, signaling the bartender to refill their glasses. "Thank you. So, what brings you here tonight? Are you seeing anyone?" "I'm trying," Vicky answered, her eyes sparkling. "Trying to get back into the dating scene, anyway." Martin raised an eyebrow. "I thought I remembered a rather impressive stone on your finger. Was I mistaken?" "Not entirely," Vicky said with a laugh. "It wasn't long before my divorce was finalized. I wore my rings while trying to convince my ex-husband that he had more in common with a 20-year-old cashier than just wanting to get into her bed with one of her friends. Obviously, I didn't succeed." Martin chuckled. "Oh my. Are they still together?" Vicky's expression turned indifferent. "This may surprise you, Mr. Miller, but once my divorce was finalized, I lost all interest in Wayne's marital status. I don't have the slightest idea." Martin winced slightly at the formality. "Please, call me Marty. Or Martin. Or even an expletive, but not Mr. Miller." "What did your wife call you?" Vicky asked with a curious glance. "Well, Martin, could you take me to the dance floor?" she asked, interrupting his thoughts. "I'd like to dance." Martin agreed and asked the bartender to keep their drinks safe behind the bar. Taking Vicky by the hand, he led her to the dance floor. They started with a fast-paced song, quickly falling into sync. When the tempo slowed down, they stayed on the floor, embracing each other to the mellow music. Vicky wrapped her arms around Martin's neck while his hands rested securely on her back. The closeness and the lack of a bra beneath her dress were palpable. They shared a tender moment, gazing into each other's eyes before Vicky rested her head on his shoulder. As the second song began, Martin was lost in the sensations of being with this beautiful woman, who smelled intoxicatingly good. When the music volume dropped slightly, Vicky seized the moment. "Martin, I'm already tired of dancing, and I'm feeling quite lonely," she whispered in his ear. "How about you take me home and do something about it?" Martin took her hand and led her back to the bar. He paid the bill and informed the bartender they wouldn't be needing any more drinks. With Vicky having arrived in an Uber, they climbed into Martin's car. As they drove to his apartment, Martin glanced at her. Maybe I should have asked this earlier, he said, but how much did you drink tonight? It was Martin's first glass of wine at the bar when Vicky approached him. She leaned in, her smile a mix of intrigue and flirtation. So, what's the catch? She asked, her voice carrying a hint of playfulness. Martin's smile grew. I don't take advantage of intoxicated women. Don't worry about it. Vicky laughed, a light, musical sound that drew the attention of a few patrons. Good to know, she said, her eyes sparkling. The two exchanged a few more flirtatious remarks before they decided to leave. They drove to Martin's place, his underground garage offering a quiet, private retreat. The elevator ride was filled with a charged silence, both of them eagerly anticipating what the night might hold. As soon as the door to Martin's apartment closed behind them, Vicky wasted no time. She pulled the hem of her dress over her head with a bold, confident movement. Oh my God, Vicky, you're stunning, Martin said, his voice filled with admiration. Thank you, Martin, Vicky replied, her eyes locking onto his. But what are you waiting for? Just going to watch? Definitely not just watching, Martin said with a grin, taking her hand and guiding her down the corridor to his bedroom. Dallas was spending the weekend with her mother, so they had the place to themselves. I hope you have condoms, Vicky teased as they entered the bedroom. Martin opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a small supply, placing them on the nightstand with a smirk. I'm prepared, he said. For the next hour, their passions took over. The connection between them was electric, and they lost themselves in the throes of a vigorous and satisfying encounter. Eventually, they settled into a relaxed, contented state. Martin lay on his back while Vicky snuggled against him, her head resting on his chest. As they drifted in that peculiar state between wakefulness and sleep, Vicky stirred. Martin, she began, her voice soft and thoughtful, I just remembered something. You mentioned erectile dysfunction before. So, I was wondering if you still have that issue. Martin chuckled softly. Not anymore. After the accident with the oak tree, I started feeling a tingling sensation, like something was coming back to life. It was strange, kind of like a paralyzed limb starting to recover. That went on for weeks. Were you still married at that point? Vicky asked, her curiosity piqued. Yes, officially still married, Martin replied. But Diana and I had been living apart for several weeks. I didn't tell her about it. It was none of her business. Interesting. And what did the doctor say? Vicky inquired. They didn't have a concrete answer, Martin said. They ran all kinds of tests and compared them to the ones from before the accident. The best they could come up with was that maybe hitting the tree somehow triggered the recovery. They think the problem might have been with the brain, and it just healed. Well, that's fortunate, Vicky said. So, are you ready for a serious relationship? Martin's question took Vicky by surprise. She hadn't really thought about it in those terms. For months, she had been telling herself she didn't need a man in her life. She had a good job and great friends, and she was content. But deep down, she knew she wanted more. I wasn't expecting that question, Vicky said slowly. I was just focused on having a good time. But if I'm honest, I do want something more meaningful. I just worry about what a decent guy would think if I told him the whole truth about my life and past. Martin's expression softened. We can talk about it in the morning, he suggested. For now, let's just enjoy the moment. They settled into sleep, and in the morning, Vicky woke up before Martin. Not wanting to disturb him, she quietly used his shower and then headed to the kitchen. She rummaged through his pantry and found some ingredients. Determined to make breakfast, she put on an apron she had found in his closet and started cooking. When Martin awoke, the smell of cooking food drew him out of bed. He stumbled into the kitchen to find Vicky, wearing one of his shirts and an apron, working diligently. I was going to invite you to breakfast, Vicky said with a smile. It's not too late, Martin replied, his eyes twinkling with amusement. You can invite me to lunch. Vicky laughed and told him to hurry up and take a shower. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, she promised. True to her word, Vicky had breakfast ready when Martin joined her at the table. She had prepared an omelette, sausages, and buttered toast. "I didn't know I had sausages," Martin remarked as he took a bite. "But this is delicious." Vicky beamed at the compliment. "I'm glad you like it." As they enjoyed their meal together, the future seemed full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, Martin felt a glimmer of hope for what might lie ahead. Breakfast was a calm affair, with Martin taking charge of cleaning up since Vicky had been kind enough to prepare the meal. They chatted about mundane things as they worked, and once everything was loaded into the dishwasher, Martin turned to Vicky. "Are you ready to talk?" he asked, his tone gentle but serious. Vicky glanced at him, her expression a mix of apprehension and resolve. "I don't want to put you in a difficult position or interfere with your plans. If this is just about getting together, that's fine. You don't owe me anything. But there's something I need to tell you." Martin nodded, sensing the gravity in her voice. "Let's talk in the bedroom. I'll be more comfortable there." They walked hand in hand to the bedroom and sat on the bed, facing each other. Vicky squeezed Martin's hands, drawing strength from his presence. "Martin, I know we really only met last night, but I feel like I need to be honest with you," she began. "I think you're a great guy, and I definitely like you. But there's something you should know. I mentioned that my husband left me for a 20-year-old, and that's true. But there's more to the story. The real reason he left was that I can't have children. He wanted a family, and he saw not having children as a personal failure. I was the reason for that." Martin listened intently, his expression softening as Vicky spoke. "I'm over 40 and have an adult daughter. I wouldn't mind having more children, but it's not a barrier for me." "I'm glad to hear that," Vicky said, a small smile appearing on her lips. "After the divorce, I felt pretty down about myself. I was getting older and had just lost my husband to someone much younger. I'm 37, by the way. I felt incomplete and, honestly, I didn't feel like a real woman. If I couldn't have children, I thought I'd prove my womanhood by satisfying men, mostly anonymous encounters. I went by the name Angela and never turned down a chance to go home with someone. This went on for months until I realized it was self-destructive. I started seeing a therapist and eventually cut back, though it took some time to stop entirely." Martin, ever the listener, was careful not to judge. "Is that what you were doing last night?" he asked gently. He had seen the predatory look in her eyes but wanted to understand her perspective, not pass judgment. "Yes, it was," Vicky admitted. "I have needs and sometimes I seek to fulfill them. I was less selective before, but now I choose more carefully. There were nights when I came home alone and took care of things myself. I suppose I should be glad that I passed the test." Martin nodded, taking in her confession. "I appreciate your honesty, Vicky. It's not easy to share something so personal. I really enjoy spending time with you, and I'd like to explore where this might lead. I've been checked and luckily didn't contract anything, which was incredibly fortunate. I don't need birth control, but I can get a note from my doctor if you need proof. I'd like us both to get tested and agree to be exclusive if you're willing." Martin sat in silence for several minutes, processing her words. Vicky waited, her anxiety barely masked. Finally, he spoke. "Vicky, thank you for being so honest. I know it wasn't easy. Our experiences aren't that different. After my divorce, I felt a sense of relief but also a deep depression about my own inadequacies. I didn't know how I'd ever find a partner again. My therapist pointed out that as we age, many women lose interest in sex and prefer other forms of affection. I thought I'd have to find someone much older or wait until I was in better shape. When I did start to recover, I felt the need to prove my masculinity. I sought out many women to validate myself, and I wasn't particularly discerning. I've had my fair share of encounters, and I ended up with a bout of gonorrhea, which I had to admit to my doctor, an embarrassing moment for sure." Martin's eyes reflected a mix of regret and understanding. I cleared everything up with my doctor and, during therapy, began focusing on my own emotional recovery. Vicky reached out and took his hand. I'm glad we can be open with each other. It's important to be honest if we're going to explore something together. Martin squeezed her hand in return. Absolutely. Let's move forward with transparency and mutual respect. They shared a moment of silent understanding, each reflecting on their pasts while looking ahead to what might come next. It had been a while since Martin had been with a woman without protection, but he was ready to be tested and was open to an exclusive relationship. So, are we going to give this a serious try, you and me? Vicky asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity and hope. Martin grinned, a playful glint in his eyes. I'd say that's a fair bet, he replied, acknowledging her question with a nod. By lunchtime, Martin's supply of condoms had been completely used up, a testament to how quickly their relationship had progressed. Their relationship was flourishing. Vicky and Martin had been dating for about 3 months. They had their own places but spent every night together, and it was clear that their bond was growing stronger. Vicky and Martin had settled into a comfortable routine, and their future seemed promising. They enjoyed their nights out at a club that catered to a more mature crowd, where a DJ spun music and the design allowed for both dancing and meaningful conversation. One evening, while enjoying their drinks and discussing various topics, Martin's demeanor suddenly shifted. His smile faded, and his gaze drifted past Vicky. She turned to see what had caught his attention and saw Diana approaching. Diana's face was etched with a smug grin, and she walked towards their table with an air of familiarity that made Vicky's unease palpable. Martin's face quickly assumed a neutral expression. "Diana, what a surprise," he said, trying to mask his irritation. "This is Vicky, my current girlfriend." "Vicky, this is my ex-wife, Diana." Diana's smile was cold and insincere. "Nice to meet you, Vicky. I've heard a lot about you," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Vicky responded with a polite smile, "Nice to meet you, Diana." Diana didn't bother to hide her bitterness. "I've heard absolutely nothing about you," she retorted, then turned her attention to Martin. "We've been divorced for over a year now. My life is no longer your concern, and frankly, it's none of your business." Martin's response was a terse, "Diana, it's been a year. I'd appreciate it if you'd let us enjoy our evening." Diana's smile remained, though her eyes were sharp with intent. "Oh, Martin, I wouldn't want to intrude. But Vicky, there's something you should know." Vicky glanced at Martin, then back at Diana, her curiosity piqued. "And what might that be?" Diana's voice took on a conspiratorial tone. "You probably don't want to get too involved with him. We got divorced because he couldn't perform." Martin watched Vicky's reaction closely. She stifled a quiet giggle and raised an eyebrow at Martin. "Is this true?" she asked, clearly intrigued. Martin shrugged nonchalantly. "It's Vicky's call now. Diana's just playing her game." Diana, feeling triumphant, believed she had struck a decisive blow. She relished the thought of causing a rift between Martin and Vicky, imagining it as payback for her own heartbreak with Bill. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Vicky, unfazed, responded with a smirk. "That's funny, because if what I experienced last night wasn't a real erection, then I'm not sure what would count as one. I guess the supposed problem is no longer an issue." Diana's grin faltered, her confusion apparent. "Wait, what is she talking about?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Martin, you don't mean to say it actually works now?" Martin and Vicky exchanged a look, their amusement evident. Diana seemed to have been left in the dark about Martin's progress, a fact that had clearly escaped her notice. "Come on, Marty," Diana continued, her tone becoming more insistent. "This issue ended our marriage. I think I deserve to know what was wrong." Martin's expression hardened. "First of all, Diana, it was your actions that ended our marriage, not my condition. You made your choices, not me. And second, you don't get to demand explanations. We're divorced, and my personal life is my business. Your choices led you to where you are, not my condition." Diana's face reddened, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I understand that, but I wouldn't have acted the way I did if things were normal." Martin's voice was firm and unyielding. "The doctors believe that whatever the issue was, it just needed time to heal after that accident. If you had been patient and stayed with me, things might have been different." Diana's demeanor shifted from confrontation to defeat as she realized she couldn't win this argument. The evening ended with her retreating from the table, leaving Martin and Vicky to continue their night undisturbed. As the night wore on, Martin and Vicky's bond felt stronger than ever. They had faced a significant challenge, and their ability to handle it with grace and humor only deepened their connection. The revelation hit Diana like a sledgehammer. She stood there, her mouth agape, struggling to process the gravity of Martin's words. The room seemed to close in around her as the shock of his statement sunk in. "I can't believe this," Diana said, her voice barely a whisper. "God must really be punishing me." Martin, his voice tinged with resignation, murmured, "He just wants to see if I still believe in the vows we took." Diana, her eyes wide with disbelief, asked, "What was that you just said?" "Nothing," Martin replied, shaking his head. "It's nothing at all. So, now you know. Could you please give us some privacy for the rest of the evening?" Diana stood there, lost in thought, for a moment that felt like an eternity. Her eyes met Martin's, and she saw the pain and resignation in his gaze. After a tense pause, she finally spoke. "You're right, Marty," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I was wrong. I was short-sighted and selfish. I should have been stronger. I ruined something that was good. I'm really sorry." With those words, Diana turned on her heel and walked away, not just from their table, but from the club entirely. Martin and Vicky watched her leave, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and relief. As Diana disappeared into the night, Martin turned back to Vicky, a faint smile on his lips. "Shall we dance, my love?" The atmosphere in the club shifted as they moved to the dance floor, their connection growing deeper with each step. 6 months later, Martin and Vicky celebrated their marriage, a testament to their journey through heartache and healing. "Subscribe to our channel," the voiceover announced, "so your next chapter is filled with fidelity and love. Don't miss out on our next story. Believe me, it's a roller coaster compared to this one. And if you're under 18, this next one's not for you." As the screen faded to black, the promise of new stories and fresh beginnings hung in the air,